spring rain fell in fat drops across the Montana Territory, turning the wagon roads into ribbons of mud that stretched between the rolling hills like scars on green velvet. Briggs Talford pulled his coat collar higher and squinted through the downpour at the iron gates, rising before him like monuments to someone else's fortune. The ornate metalwork spelled out Creel Ranch in letters tall enough to brand the sky itself. He checked the soggy delivery slip in his pocket one more time. Morrison Ranch, it read clearly, but the ink had begun to run. The address matched what he remembered the merchant saying back in Billings, though the merchant had been 3 whiskeys deep when he'd given the directions. Briggs looked at the grand estate beyond the gates, then at his own mud-caked boots and the patched elbows of his wool coat. The mountain man had been working the high country for 12 years now, ever since that ugly business in Denver had sent him seeking solitude among the peaks. He trapped in winter, guided hunters in summer, and avoided towns except when necessity demanded. But winter had been longer than usual, and his savings had dwindled to almost nothing. When old Pete at the trading post mentioned a rancher needing someone to deliver a specialized bit and bridle set to a spread south of town, Briggs had jumped at the $5 fee. Now standing before gates that belonged in a picture book rather than the Montana wilderness, he wondered if Pete's directions had been as reliable as his whiskey recommendation. The thunder rolled overhead as Briggs pushed open the gate and started up the long drive. His boots squelched in the mud with each step, leaving a trail that would make any housemaid curse his name. The main house loomed ahead, all white columns and wraparound porches, looking like something transplanted from a southern plantation, rather than built for Montana winters. He climbed the front steps, leaving muddy prints on the pristine white boards, and knocked on the door. The sound echoed hollow and formal. A moment later, the door swung open to reveal a stern-faced woman in a grey dress, her silver hair pulled back in a bun, so tight it could have been carved from marble. "Deliveries go to the back door," she said, looking at his boots with the expression she might reserve for something she'd scraped off her shoe. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Briggs said, touching the brim of his hat. "I've got a delivery for Morrison Ranch, but the sign out front says Creel. Wondering if I might have taken a wrong turn." The woman's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Morrison Ranch. Young man, Morrison Ranch burned to the ground 3 years ago. Old Morrison moved to California after his wife passed." "You've got the wrong place entirely." Before Briggs could respond, another voice cut through the humid air. "What's all the commotion, Mrs. Henley?" The woman who appeared in the doorway made Briggs forget every word he'd ever learned. She stood tall, maybe 5'6", with auburn hair caught up in a practical knot that somehow managed to look elegant despite the escaped wisps framing her face. Her green eyes held the kind of intelligence that could cut glass, and when she looked at him, Briggs felt like she could see straight through to his backbone. Zadie Creel wore a simple blue dress that probably cost more than Briggs made in a month, but she wore it like work clothes. Her hands showed calluses that spoke of genuine labor, and there was mud on her boots too, which made Briggs feel marginally less like a vagrant at her front door. "This gentleman has a delivery for Morrison Ranch," Mrs. Henley said with a sniff. "I was just explaining that he has the wrong address." Zadie's gaze moved from the housekeeper to Briggs, taking in his soaked coat, muddy boots, and the leather satchel under his arm. When her eyes met his, something electric passed between them that had nothing to do with the lightning flashing overhead. "Morrison's been gone for years," she said, her voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested she'd spent plenty of time calling orders across wide spaces. "But if you've come all this way, in this weather, the least I can do is invite you in to dry off while you figure out your next move." Mrs. Henley's expression suggested this was a terrible idea, but she stepped aside as her employer gestured for Briggs to enter. He wiped his boots on the mat as thoroughly as possible, but the damage was already done. Each step across the marble foyer left a perfect muddy boot print, creating a trail that would have made a tracker proud and a housekeeper weep. "I appreciate the kindness, miss," Briggs began. Mrs. Creel, she corrected, though no ring adorned her finger. And you are? Briggs Talford, man. I do some guiding and trapping up in the high country. Merchant in Billings, said Morrison Ranch needed someone to deliver some custom tack work, but it seems his information was a bit dated. Zadie nodded toward the formal parlor. Sit anywhere that won't be ruined by wet clothes. Mrs. Henley, could you bring some coffee? And perhaps see if Cook has any of that beef stew left. As they settled into chairs by the fireplace, Briggs tried not to notice how the firelight caught the gold threads in Zadie's hair, or how her dress pulled slightly across her chest when she leaned forward to pour coffee from the silver service. Mrs. Henley had grudgingly provided. So tell me, Mr. Talford, she said, handing him a cup of coffee that was better than anything he'd tasted in months. What exactly was in that delivery you were supposed to make? Briggs opened the leather satchel and withdrew a bit, and bridle set unlike anything typically seen in Montana. The metalwork was elaborate, silver chased and engraved with patterns of roses and thorns. The leather was dyed deep burgundy and tooled with matching designs. Fancy piece, Zadie said, running her finger along the intricate leatherwork. Morrison always did have expensive tastes. His wife used to show horses back east before they came out here. Merchant said it was ordered special from a craftsman in St. Louis. Cost the buyer $47. Zadie's eyebrows rose. $47. For a bit and bridle, I could buy a decent horse for that much. Before Briggs could respond, the parlor door burst open with a crash that made both of them jump. A round man in a flour-dusted apron stumbled through the doorway, carrying a pot of stew that sloshed dangerously with each step. Mrs. Zadie, he called out in a voice that carried a thick accent Briggs couldn't place. I brought the stew like you asked, but I gotta tell you about the chickens, because they've been acting mighty strange, and I think maybe they're sick, or maybe they just don't like the new feed. But either way we might want to. His foot caught on the edge of the oriental rug, and he pitched forward with a yelp. The pot of stew flew from his hands, describing a perfect arc through the air before landing with a tremendous crash on the marble floor. Brown stew splattered in every direction, coating the furniture, the walls, and both Briggs and Zadie. Orville, Zadie exclaimed, but there was more exasperation than anger in her voice, as if this sort of thing happened regularly. The cook, for that's clearly what he was, sat on the floor in the middle of the stew puddle, looking mortified. Oh, Mrs. Zadie, I'm so sorry. I swear these boots have it out for me. Just this morning I tripped over them putting on my pants, and then at lunch Orville, Zadie interrupted gently. Perhaps we could discuss your footwear difficulties after we clean up the stew. As if summoned by the sound of disaster, Mrs. Henley appeared in the doorway. She surveyed the scene, the splattered stew, the muddy boot prints, and her employer sitting in a parlor chair with beef gravy dripping from her hair, with the expression of a woman whose worst nightmares had suddenly become reality. I'll get the mops, she said in a tone that suggested she was already composing her resignation letter. Zadie began to laugh. It started as a chuckle, then built into genuine mirth that shook her whole body. Briggs found himself grinning, and even Orville, still sitting in the stew, began to smile. Well, Mr. Talford, Zadie said, wiping stew from her cheek with the back of her hand, I'd say this puts us on fairly equal footing as far as making impressions goes. Briggs reached into his coat and produced a clean handkerchief. If I may? She tilted her chin up, and he gently wiped the gravy from her temple and cheek. Her skin was warm under his fingers, and when his thumb brushed across a missed spot near her ear, she drew in a sharp breath that had nothing to do with the cold. The moment stretched between them, electric and full of possibility, until Orville chose that moment to attempt standing up. His feet slid in the stew, and he went down again with a crash that shook the windows. Maybe, Zadie said, her voice slightly breathless, We should move to the kitchen while Mrs. Henley deals with this disaster. As they helped Orville to his feet and made their way through the house, Briggs couldn't help but notice how Zadie moved through her grand home like she owned every inch of it, which of course she did. But there was something else, a loneliness that hung around her like morning mist, visible only when the light hit it just right. The kitchen of Creel Ranch was a warm, practical space that felt more like home than the formal parlor. A massive cast-iron stove dominated one wall, surrounded by shelves full of preserves, dried herbs and the thousand small necessities that kept a working ranch fed. Zadie settled into a chair at the scrubbed pine table, while Orville busied himself cleaning up his stew-splattered person at the pump. "So," Zadie said, wrapping her hands around a fresh cup of coffee, "what will you do about your delivery situation?" "The nearest Morrison relatives are in Sacramento, and I doubt they're in the market for fancy horse tack." Briggs turned the expensive bit over in his hands, studying the intricate silverwork. "Reckon I'll head back to Billings and return it to the merchant. He can sort out what to do with it, though I won't be seeing that $5 delivery fee." $5? Zadie's eyebrows rose. "That's not much for a day's ride in this weather." "It's something," Briggs said with a shrug. "And I needed the something." She studied him over the rim of her coffee cup, those green eyes sharp with calculation. "What kind of work do you usually do, besides deliveries that go to the wrong address?" "Hunting guide, mostly. Trapping, some timber work when I can get it. Spent 12 years up in the high country, so I know the territory pretty well. Know anything about cattle?" "Some." "Why?" Zadie leaned back in her chair, and Briggs could practically see the wheels turning in her mind. "I've got 8,000 head scattered across 40,000 acres, and spring roundup starts in 2 weeks. My foreman quit last month to start his own spread, and the man I hired to replace him turned out to be better at drinking than working. I let him go yesterday. Looking for help? Looking for someone who can do the job right. This ranch has been in my family for 15 years, and I'll be damned if I let it fall apart on my watch." There was steel in her voice now, the kind of determination that had built empires in the wilderness. "But I'm not interested in hiring another man who thinks he can charm his way into a permanent position while doing half the work." Briggs set down his coffee cup. "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Creel?" "A trial period. 2 months. Through spring roundup and into summer grazing. You help me get this ranch running smoothly, and I'll pay you $50 a month, plus room and board." It was more money than Briggs had seen in one place for longer than he cared to admit. But there was something in her tone that suggested there was more to this offer than simple employment. "What's the catch?" Zadie smiled, and it was the kind of smile that probably made lesser men agree to things they'd regret later. 3 conditions. First, you have to prove you can handle the cattle work. Get the herds healthy and settled in their summer range without losing more than 5% to predators or accidents. Fair enough. Second, fix the water system. We've got problems with the main well and 2 of the irrigation channels. Cattle can't graze on dry grass, and I can't afford to lose hay crop this year." Briggs nodded. The water work would be challenging, but not impossible for a man who'd spent years dealing with mountain streams and springs. And third, Zadie's smile widened, and Briggs suddenly felt like a rabbit that had just noticed the hawks circling overhead. Social obligations. There are certain expectations that come with being associated with this ranch. Community events, church functions, the occasional dinner party. I need someone who can represent Creel Ranch properly in polite society. "Ma'am, I haven't been to a dinner party in about 12 years, and I'm pretty sure the last church I visited is still standing, only because God's got a sense of humor." "Then you'll learn," she said simply. "Those are my terms. Meet all 3 conditions, and you'll have a permanent position here with a $75 monthly salary." Briggs was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. There was more than business in this proposal. He was certain of it. But $50 was $50, and he'd slept in worse places than a ranch bunkhouse. "I accept your terms, Mrs. Creel, but I've got a condition of my own. Her eyebrows rose. "Oh, a side wager, just between us." He leaned forward, matching her challenging smile with one of his own. "If I meet all three of your conditions and do something else besides, something more personal, then you owe me something in return. Such as, if I can give you 3 full nights of good sleep, no lying awake worrying about ranch business, no getting up to check on things that don't need checking, then you owe me one evening. Dinner, dancing, conversation, whatever I choose within reason." The kitchen went very quiet. Even Orville, who had been clattering around with pots and pans, stopped to listen. Zadie's green eyes narrowed. "That's a very personal wager, Mr. Talford. It's a very personal problem, Mrs. Creel. I can see it in your eyes, the way you keep looking toward the windows, checking things that don't need checking. You're carrying this whole place on your shoulders, and it's wearing you down." For a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked, and he saw something vulnerable underneath. Then the steel returned. "You're assuming a great deal about my sleeping habits. Am I wrong?" She was quiet for a long moment. "And if you fail to give me these 3 miraculous nights of rest, then I work the 2 months, take my $100, and disappear back into the mountains. No permanent position, no more presumptuous wagers." Zadie tapped her fingers on the table, considering. "You realize that if you're wrong about this, about me, you'll have thrown away a steady job for the sake of your wounded pride. Maybe. But I don't think I'm wrong." She extended her hand across the table. "Shake on it, Mr. Talford. Though I should warn you that I'm not easily impressed by men who think they can solve my problems for me." Their hands met across the pine table, and the contact sent a jolt through Briggs that had nothing to do with static electricity. Her palm was used from work, her grip firm and sure. When she smiled, it was like watching sunrise break over a mountain peak. "I'll have Mrs. Henley set you up in the foreman's cabin," she said. "It's small but clean, and it's got its own kitchen if you prefer to do your own cooking. Cooking's not exactly my strongest skill. Lucky for you, Orville here makes enough food for half the territory." She glanced toward the cook, who was pretending not to eavesdrop while he organized the spice shelf for the 3rd time. "Orville Cantrell, meet Briggs Talford, our new foreman." Orville turned with a grin that split his round face from ear to ear. "Pleased to meet you proper, Mr. Talford. I gotta say, any man who doesn't mind getting stew thrown on him in the first 10 minutes is all right by me. Most folks get all huffy about my accidents. But Mrs. Zadie here, she just laughs it off. Course, she's probably used to it by now, seeing as how I've been dropping things and tripping over my own feet since I got here, 6 months ago. Just last week." Orville," Zadie interrupted gently. "Perhaps Mr. Talford would like to see his accommodations before we plan the rest of his natural life." "All right. Yes, ma'am. I'll just finish cleaning up this mess and then maybe start thinking about what to make for dinner. I was thinking maybe some of that venison stew, but without the throwing it on the floor part this time, and maybe some biscuits if I can remember not to use salt instead of sugar like I did Tuesday." And Orville, "Right, stopping now." As they prepared to leave the warmth of the kitchen, Briggs caught Zadie's eye. "Mrs. Creel, one more question." "Yes, that fancy tack I was supposed to deliver to Morrison Ranch. What do you think it's worth to someone who appreciates quality craftsmanship?" She tilted her head, studying him. "I'd say about $47 to someone who knew what they were looking at." "Why?" "Because I think I know someone who might be interested in buying it. Someone who deserves something beautiful." The look that passed between them was full of possibility and promise, like the moment before lightning strikes when the whole world holds its breath. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, and the first tentative rays of sunlight slanted through the kitchen windows, painting everything in gold. 3 weeks into his employment at Creel Ranch, Briggs had fallen into a rhythm that felt more natural than anything he'd experienced in years. The cattle work suited him, and the animals had responded well to his steady presence. The water system repairs were progressing ahead of schedule, and he'd managed to navigate 2 community functions without embarrassing himself or his employer beyond repair. But it was the evenings that had surprised him most. As the sun set behind the western peaks and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet, Briggs found himself drawn to the main house like iron filings to a magnet. Not to the grand parlors or formal dining room, but to the practical spaces where Zadie spent her real time. The kitchen, the ranch office, the wide front porch where she liked to sit with her account books and a cup of coffee. She'd begun to relax around him, letting her carefully maintained composure slip enough that he could see the woman beneath the ranch owner's facade. She was funny, sharp-witted, in ways that kept him constantly off balance, and possessed of a fierce intelligence that made their conversations feel like intellectual sparring matches. She was also, he'd noticed, sleeping better. The dark circles under her eyes had begun to fade, and she no longer started at every unexpected sound. When he'd mentioned it the previous evening, she'd given him a look that was equal parts grateful and suspicious. "Don't get ahead of yourself, Mr. Talford," she'd said. "2 nights of decent sleep don't constitute a miracle." But on this particular evening, as storm clouds gathered over the valley and the first fat raindrops began to spatter the dust, Briggs found himself facing a different kind of challenge entirely. The eastern fence line had taken a beating in the afternoon's wind, and several sections of wire had snapped, leaving gaps large enough for cattle to wander through. Briggs had ridden out to assess the damage, expecting to find routine repair work. Instead, he'd discovered that one particularly troublesome section would require complete replacement, a job that needed 2 pairs of hands and several hours of concentrated work. He'd returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, muddy and frustrated, to find Zadie in the big barn checking on a mare who'd been showing signs of lameness. "How bad is it?" she asked, looking up from the horse's hoof. "Bad enough that it can't wait until morning. That section goes down, and we'll have cattle scattered from here to Billings by dawn. But it's a 2-person job, and most of the hands went into town for the evening." Zadie straightened, brushing hay from her skirt. "Then I suppose you'll have 2 people. Let me get my coat, Mrs. Creel." "You don't need to, Mr. Talford," she interrupted, fixing him with that green-eyed stare that could stop a charging bull. "This is my ranch. If there's fence work that needs doing, I'll do it." And so, as the storm moved in, and the evening light faded to deep purple, they found themselves in the warm, lantern-lit barn, surrounded by coils of wire and fence posts, working together with the kind of easy cooperation that usually took months to develop. Zadie had changed from her good dress into practical work clothes, men's trousers that hugged her curves in ways that made Briggs's concentration waver, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days, but somehow made her look more beautiful than any fancy gown ever could. She'd braided her hair back in a single plait that hung down her back like spun copper. They worked mostly in comfortable silence, the only sounds the gentle stamping of horses in their stalls and the increasing patter of rain on the barn roof. But as they reached the most delicate part of the repair, threading a particularly stubborn wire through a tight cinch that would hold the whole section together, Briggs found himself standing directly behind her, his chest nearly touching her back as they both leaned over the work. "It's not going through," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "The opening's too small and the wires too thick." Briggs could smell her hair, lavender soap, and honest sweat, and something else that was purely feminine. When she moved slightly, trying to get better leverage on the wire, her body brushed against his, and he had to grip the fence post to steady himself. "Here," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Let me show you a trick." He reached around her, his arms bracketing her body as he positioned his hands over hers on the wire. She went very still, and he could feel the rapid rise and fall of her breathing. "The secret," he murmured, his mouth close to her ear, "is not to force it. You have to ease it in, gentle-like, until you find the right angle. His hands guided hers, showing her how to twist the wire, just so, how to apply pressure at precisely the right point. The lantern light flickered over them, casting dancing shadows on the barn walls. "There," he said, as the wire began to slide through the cinch. "Feel how it wants to go." "Yes," she breathed, and he wasn't entirely sure they were still talking about fence repair. The wire caught again, just at the most crucial moment, and Zadie made a small sound of frustration. Briggs's hands tightened over hers, his body pressing closer as he adjusted their grip. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "allow me to put the tip." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from the lantern. Zadie went completely still, and for a moment Briggs thought he'd overstepped, that he'd ruined everything with his presumption. Then she turned her head slightly, just enough that he could see her profile in the golden light, and there was a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Only with my permission, Mr. Talford," she said, her voice carrying a note of challenge that made his blood run hot. "Mrs. Creel?" She nodded, just once, and the simple gesture contained more trust and invitation than 1,000 spoken words. Briggs guided the wire through the final inches of the cinch, his movements sure and careful. When it finally slipped through completely, they both exhaled in relief, but neither of them moved away. Instead, Zadie turned in the circle of his arms, her face tilted up toward his. In the lantern light, her eyes looked like deep forest pools, mysterious and inviting. Her lips were slightly parted, and when she spoke, her voice was soft as velvet. "That was very skillfully done, Mr. Talford. Just fence work, Mrs. Creel. Was it?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Briggs reached up to touch her cheek, his coil-used fingers gentle against her smooth skin. She leaned into the touch, her eyes drifting closed. "Zadie," he said, her first name feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue. "Yes?" Instead of answering, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was nothing like the rough, demanding kisses he'd shared with saloon girls in his younger days. This was soft, exploratory, full of questions and possibilities. Zadie's hands came up to rest on his chest, and he could feel her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Zadie's hair had come loose from its braid, framing her face in soft waves. Her lips were slightly swollen, and there was color high in her cheeks. "Briggs," she started to say, but whatever she'd been about to tell him was lost in the sudden crash of the barn door flying open. "Mrs. Zadie," Orville's voice boomed through the barn like a foghorn. "I brought you some coffee and sandwiches because I figured you'd be working late and might get hungry, and I also wanted to tell you about the chickens again, because I really think there's something wrong with them." And he stopped abruptly as he took in the scene before him. Zadie and Briggs standing very close together in the lantern light, her hair loose, and his hands still resting on her waist. The coffee pot in Orville's hands tilted dangerously as his eyes widened. "Oh," he said, "am I interrupting? Agriculture?" Zadie started to laugh, and the sound broke the tension like a stone thrown into still water. Briggs grinned, stepping back but keeping one hand on her elbow. "Something like that," he said. Orville, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor, set the coffee pot on a nearby hay bale and began backing toward the door. I'll leave this here for you folks, and maybe I'll go check on those chickens again. Take my time with it." Really thorough examination of the chickens. Very, very thorough. He was almost to the door when his foot caught on a coil of wire. With a yelp that could probably be heard in the next county, he pitched forward, arms windmilling wildly. He landed face first in a pile of fresh hay, his legs kicking in the air like an overturned beetle. Zadie dissolved into laughter, leaning against Briggs for support as tears streamed down her cheeks. Even Briggs couldn't suppress his chuckles as they helped Orville extract himself from the hay pile. "I'm all right," Orville announced, bits of hay sticking out of his hair at all angles. "Perfectly fine. Just communing with nature, as you might say." very educational experience. I learned that hay is softer than it looks, but pricklier than you'd expect, and also that I really need to watch where I'm walking more carefully. As they brushed hay from his clothes and restored some semblance of order to the barn, Briggs caught Zadie's eye. The moment they'd shared was broken, but the promise of it lingered in the air between them, like the scent of lavender. Later, as they walked back to the main house through the gentle rain, she slipped her hand into his. "That's one night of good sleep you've earned, Mr. Talford," she said quietly. "Just one?" She squeezed his fingers. "We'll see about the other two." But as they reached the porch steps, Briggs noticed a lone rider approaching through the rain, his expensive horse and fancy saddle gleaming even in the dim light. The man's face was hard to make out in the darkness, but something about his posture suggested trouble. "Who's that?" Briggs asked. Zadie's expression hardened as she recognized the visitor. "Trouble," she said. "That's Cortland Vera, and he owns half the cattle operations in the territory. If he's here this late, it's not for a social call." The rider approached the porch, touching the brim of his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Mrs. Creel," he said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "I hope you don't mind the late hour, but I was riding past and couldn't help but notice the lights in your barn. Having some difficulties?" His gaze moved from Zadie to Briggs, taking in their work clothes and the obvious signs of their evening's labor. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing we couldn't handle," Zadie replied coolly. "Mr. Vera, allow me to introduce my foreman, Briggs Talford." "Briggs, this is Cortland Vera." Vera dismounted and climbed the porch steps, extending his hand to Briggs with a grip that lingered just long enough to be a challenge. He was a tall man, well-dressed despite the weather, with the kind of polished confidence that came from never having been told no. "Talford," he mused. "Can't say I'm familiar with the name." "You new to the territory, new to ranching," Briggs replied evenly, "but not new to hard work." "Indeed." Vera's smile became more pronounced. "Well, I'm sure you'll find that ranching requires a certain refinement. It's not all fence posts and cattle drives. There are social obligations, community standards to maintain. Not everyone is suited for the responsibilities that come with representing a ranch like Creel." The insult was subtle, but unmistakable, and Briggs felt his temper begin to rise. Before he could respond, however, Zadie stepped forward. "Mr. Vera, I'm sure you didn't ride out in this weather just to discuss my hiring practices. What can I do for you?" Vera's attention returned to her, and there was something in his gaze that made Briggs want to step between them. "Actually, I came to invite you to the Cattlemen's Association dinner next Saturday. It's been too long since you've attended one of our gatherings, and there are several matters of mutual interest that we should discuss, such as water rights primarily. There's been some talk about reorganizing the irrigation districts, and I'd hate for you to be left out of the planning process." The threat was politely worded, but clear as crystal. Zadie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "How thoughtful of you to be concerned about my interests," she said. "I'll consider attending." "Excellent. And of course you're welcome to bring your foreman if you think he'd be comfortable in such company." This time the insult was aimed directly at Briggs, and there was no mistaking the challenge in Vera's tone. The man was clearly testing them both, probing for weaknesses. "I'm sure Mr. Talford would be delighted to attend," Zadie said smoothly. "He's been quite eager to meet more of our neighbors." Vera's smile faltered for just a moment, before returning full force. "Splendid. I look forward to seeing you both there." He remounted his horse with fluid grace, touching his hat brim once more before riding off into the night. They watched until his figure disappeared into the darkness. Then Zadie turned to Briggs, with an expression of grim determination. "Well," she said, "it looks like we'll be finding out sooner than expected whether you can handle the social obligations part of this job. What exactly just happened here?" "Cortland Vera just declared war," she replied. "The dinner invitation was a setup. He wants to humiliate you in public, prove that you're not good enough for this ranch, or for me. If he succeeds, it'll undermine my authority and give him leverage to force me out of the water rights negotiations. Briggs was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. And if I don't attend, then he wins by default. I'll look weak, and every other ranch owner in the territory will know it. So we attend, and I try not to embarrass myself too badly. Sadie took his hand, her fingers warm and sure in the cool night air. We attend, and we show him that he underestimated us both. As they stood on the porch in the gentle rain, watching lightning flicker on the horizon, Briggs couldn't help but think that fence repair had been the easy part of his evening. The Cattlemen's Association dinner was held at the Grand Imperial Hotel, the finest establishment within 200 miles of Creel Ranch. The building's red brick facade and brass fittings were meant to evoke the luxury of eastern cities, though the effect was somewhat undermined by the hitching posts out front and the spittoons scattered liberally throughout the lobby. Briggs adjusted his borrowed collar for the 5th time as he and Zadie approached the hotel's entrance. She'd managed to procure him a proper evening suit from somewhere, though he suspected it had belonged to her late husband. The fit was close enough that only someone looking for flaws would notice the slight tightness across the shoulders. "Stop fidgeting," Sadie murmured as they climbed the front steps. "You look perfectly respectable. I feel like a circus bear dressed up for tricks." "Then, be the best-dressed bear in the territory." Her gloved hand found his arm. "And remember, we're here to show them that Creel Ranch stands strong, no matter who tries to knock us down." The hotel's main dining room had been transformed for the occasion, with white tablecloths, crystal glasses, and enough silverware to outfit a small army. Briggs had seen military formations with less precise organization. At least 50 of the territory's most influential cattle barons were present, along with their wives, all dressed in the kind of finery that cost more than most people made in a year. Cortland Vera materialized beside them almost immediately, resplendent in a black evening coat that probably cost more than Briggs's horse. "Mrs. Creel, Mr. Talford, how delighted I am that you could join us." His smile was sharp enough to slice bread. "I do hope you'll find the company educational." Before either of them could respond, he'd guided them toward a table near the center of the room, where they found themselves seated with several other ranch owners and their spouses. The conversation was polite but pointed, full of subtle references to bloodlines, breeding, and proper society that made it clear exactly where a former mountain man ranked in their estimation. Briggs was halfway through the fish course when he realized something was wrong with his jacket. The seam along his left shoulder had split, leaving a gap that grew wider every time he moved his arm. Worse, he could see several of the other diners had noticed, including Cortland Vera, who was watching with unconcealed satisfaction. "Problem with your tailoring, Talford?" called out Jarvis Ketteridge from across the table, loud enough that half the room could hear. Before Briggs could respond, Zadie stood gracefully, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet. "Actually, Mr. Ketteridge, that's a deliberation modification. In the high country, Mr. Talford often had to make emergency repairs to equipment in the field. A pre-weakened seam allows quick access to tools without damaging the entire garment." She said it with such authority that several people actually nodded in understanding. Briggs had to admire her quick thinking, even as he wondered how she'd managed to turn his wardrobe malfunction into a sign of practical genius. "How innovative," Vera said, though his smile had faltered slightly. The evening continued with a series of small humiliations, clearly orchestrated to make Briggs look foolish. His dance card had been mysteriously replaced with one listing partner's half his age. The wine served at his place was notably inferior to what everyone else received. When the time came for the charity auction, his paddle number had been switched with that of a local banker's wife, leading to considerable confusion when he accidentally bid $30 on a doily. But each time something went wrong, Either Zadie found a way to turn it to their advantage, or pure chance intervened in their favor. When young Sally Morrison, the banker's 12-year-old daughter, no relation to the ranch family, proved to be his assigned dance partner, Briggs gamely taught her, and half a dozen other children, a simplified version of the Virginia reel that had the entire room clapping along. The inferior wine turned out to be a rare vintage that the sommelier had been saving for someone with a sophisticated enough palate to appreciate its subtleties. And the $30 doily became a generous donation to the local orphanage that earned him genuine applause. By the time they reached the final toast of the evening, Briggs was beginning to think they might actually survive the ordeal with their dignity intact. That was when Cortland Vera stood to address the room, crystal glass raised high. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to propose a toast to our newest member of the ranching community. Mr. Briggs Talford has certainly brought unique perspectives to our territory. It's not every day we see someone transition so seamlessly from catching wild animals to managing domestic ones." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. Several people chuckled, and Briggs felt his temper begin to rise. But before he could respond, a familiar voice boomed from the back of the room. "Excuse me, sorry, coming through, don't mind me." Orville Cantrell burst through the dining room doors, carrying a massive silver tray laden with what appeared to be an elaborate cake. He was dressed in his finest clothes, which is to say, his only clothes that didn't have flour stains, and moving with the kind of determined purpose that invariably led to disaster. "Mrs. Zadie," he called out, apparently oblivious to the formal nature of the gathering, "I brought the cake you ordered. The one with the fancy frosting roses and the sugar work on top that took me 6 hours to get right, though I dropped it twice and had to start over. But the third time was the charm, and I think you'll really like how it—" His foot caught on the edge of a Persian rug. What happened next would be discussed in cattleman circles for years to come. The cake left Orville's hands in a perfect arc, sailing through the air with the grace of a trained acrobat. It struck the ornate crystal chandelier with a resonant chime, causing the entire fixture to sway dramatically. Frosting and cake fragments rained down like sweet snow, covering several tables and their occupants in a cascade of pink and white confectionery. Cortland Vera, who had been standing directly beneath the chandelier, received the bulk of the deluge. Frosting dripped from his perfect pompadour, and cake crumbs decorated his expensive evening coat like medals of honor from a particularly indulgent war. The dining room went silent, except for the gentle plinking of frosting drops hitting crystal glasses. Then Zadie began to clap. "Bravo, Mr. Cantrell," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned quiet. "What a spectacular presentation. I don't think anyone here will forget this evening." As if her applause had broken a spell, the entire room erupted in laughter and applause. Even some of Vera's allies were struggling not to grin at the sight of the territory's most pompous cattle baron, standing knee-deep in cake debris. Briggs stood, raising his glass toward Orville, who was still sitting in the middle of the Persian rug, looking mortified. "To Orville Cantrell," he announced, "the finest cook in the Montana Territory, and a man who knows how to make an entrance." The toast was echoed throughout the room, and Briggs couldn't help but notice that Cortland Vera's earlier comment about wild animals and domestic ones had been completely forgotten in the sugary chaos. 3 days after what the local newspaper dubbed the Great Cake Catastrophe, Briggs was fixing a broken water pump when he noticed Zadie watching him from the kitchen window, with an expression he couldn't quite read. She'd been distant since the dinner, polite but formal, in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of their first meeting. He found her in the ranch office that evening, bent over account books by lamplight. The numbers on the pages seemed to blur as he watched her work, and he realized she'd been avoiding eye contact for the better part of a week. "Zadie," he said quietly, "what's wrong?" She looked up, and in the golden lamplight, he could see the uncertainty in her green eyes. Cortland Vera paid me a visit this morning. What did he want? To share some interesting information he'd gathered about your financial situation. She set down her pen and met his gaze directly. He seems to think you're in considerable debt and that your interest in this ranch is purely mercenary. Briggs felt something cold settle in his chest. And you believe him? I don't know what to believe. You've never talked about your past, about why you were living alone in the mountains for 12 years. And now Vera's suggesting that you're here under false pretenses. Before Briggs could respond, the office door burst open and Orville stumbled in, carrying a piece of paper and wearing an expression of mortified panic. Mrs. Zadie, I'm so sorry. I was trying to help, but I think I made things worse, and now everyone's going to know things they shouldn't know. And it's all my fault, because I can't read very well, and I thought the notice board at the general store was for lost items. But it turns out it was for public announcements. And Orville, Zadie interrupted gently. What did you do? He handed her the paper with trembling fingers. I wrote down all the nice things Mr. Briggs has been doing around here, thinking maybe people would see how helpful he is. But I accidentally posted it as an official notice, and now everyone thinks it's some kind of formal accounting. Zadie read the paper aloud, her voice growing warmer with each line. Notice to all, Mr. Briggs Talford has fixed the following without asking for extra pay. The broken gate latch, the loose boards on the front porch, the squeaky hinges on the barn door, the hole in the chicken coop, the wobbly table leg in the kitchen, and the roof leak over Mrs. Henley's room. He also helped Mrs. Patterson find her lost cow, taught young Timothy Morrison how to tie proper knots, and gave his own winter coat to that family whose house burned down last month. He says he doesn't want thanks, but I think people should know. Signed, Orville Cantrell, cook. When she finished reading, the office was quiet except for the soft tick of the mantel clock. Briggs felt heat rise in his cheeks. Orville, you didn't need to. Yes, I did, Orville interrupted with unusual firmness. Because Mr. Vera was telling everyone you were just here for money, and that's not true. And I know it's not true because I watch you. And you do things for people that don't cost them anything and don't get you anything, except maybe a thank you, and that's not what someone after money would do. Zadie looked at the paper again, then at Briggs. Is this accurate? Mostly, he admitted. Though I didn't give away my only coat, I had two. She studied his face for a long moment, then opened the top drawer of her desk and withdrew a leather journal. Cortland's information about your debts, is any of it true? I owe Pete Morrison $12 for supplies I bought on credit last winter. That's it. Show me. Briggs reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather wallet, worn smooth from years of use. From it, he withdrew a carefully folded piece of paper and a small cloth bag that clinked softly when he set it on the desk. That's my savings, he said, indicating the bag. $37.60. I haven't drawn my full pay yet. Told the clerk to keep it on the books while we settled the well. And that's Pete's receipt for what I owe him. Zadie opened the bag and counted the money, then read the receipt. When she looked up, her expression had changed completely. Briggs, I'm sorry. I should have asked you directly, instead of listening to rumors. You had every right to be suspicious. A man shows up at your door with a story about wrong deliveries, and within a month he's living in your foreman's cabin and kissing you in the barn. From the outside, it probably does look like I'm after your money. She stood and walked around the desk until she was standing directly in front of him. But you're not. No, ma'am, I'm not. I'm after something considerably more valuable than money. What's that? He reached up to touch her cheek, his coal-used fingers gentle against her skin. A place to belong, a woman to love, a reason to get up in the morning that isn't just about surviving another day. Instead of answering, she kissed him. It was different from their first kiss in the barn. Deeper, more certain, full of promise and apology, in equal measure. When they broke apart, They were both breathing hard. "I believe you," she whispered against his lips, "even though I'm just a mountain man with $37 to his name, especially because you're a mountain man with $37 to his name who fixes things without being asked and gives away his coat to families in need." From somewhere near the door, Orville cleared his throat. "Should I leave you folks alone for your ranch business?" They sprang apart, and Zadie smoothed her skirts while Briggs tried to look professional and failed completely. "Actually," Zadie said, her cheeks pink, but her voice steady, "I think it's time we discussed Mr. Talford's performance review. He's met all 3 of his original conditions, and I believe he's earned his permanent position." "And the wager?" Briggs asked quietly. She smiled, and it was like watching the sun come up over the mountains. 3 nights of perfect sleep, just as you promised. "I think you've earned your evening, Mr. Talford." The evening Zadie had promised him arrived on a Tuesday in late June, when the Montana sky was painted in shades of gold and purple, and the air carried the scent of wild roses. She'd spent the afternoon in mysterious preparation, banishing him from the main house and instructing him to present himself at the garden gate at precisely 8 o'clock. When the appointed hour arrived, Briggs found the gate decorated with lanterns and wild flowers, creating an archway of light that led into the side garden he'd never seen before. Zadie stood waiting for him in a dress of deep blue silk that complemented her eyes, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders instead of pinned up in its usual practical style. "Mrs. Creel," he said, offering his arm, "you look beautiful." "Thank you, Mr. Talford. And since this is my evening, I've decided we'll be dispensing with formalities. Please call me Zadie." She led him through the garden to a small clearing where a table had been set with white linens, crystal glasses, and what appeared to be a feast prepared entirely by her own hands. Candles flickered in glass globes, protecting the flames from the gentle evening breeze. "You cooked?" "I did. Mrs. Henley nearly fainted when I banished her from the kitchen, but I wanted to do this myself." She gestured toward one of the chairs. "Sit, I'll serve." The meal was simple but perfect: roasted chicken with herbs from the garden, fresh vegetables, and warm bread that filled the air with its yeasty fragrance. As they ate, they talked about everything and nothing, their conversation ranging from cattle breeding techniques to childhood memories to dreams for the future. "Tell me about Denver," she said as she refilled his wineglass. "About what sent you to the mountains." Briggs was quiet for a long moment, watching the candle flames dance. "I killed a man." Zadie's hand stilled on the wine bottle, but her voice remained steady. "What happened?" "He was beating a woman outside a saloon. His wife, I found out later. I told him to stop, and he came at me with a knife. I didn't mean to kill him, just defend myself, but he fell wrong and hit his head on the boardwalk." "Was there a trial?" "There was. Judge ruled it justifiable, but the man had family. Brothers who didn't much care about the circumstances. They made it clear I wasn't welcome in civilized society." Zadie reached across the table and took his hand. "So you exiled yourself. Seemed like the smart thing to do at the time. 12 years later, I'm not so sure. Turns out civilization has its benefits, such as good food, clean sheets, beautiful women who make a man want to be better than he is." She stood and moved around the table to stand behind his chair, her hands resting on his shoulders. There was no music except for the sound of the evening breeze through the trees and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. But when she held out her hand, he stood and took it, drawing her close as they swayed together under the Montana stars. "Zadie," he said softly, "I need to tell you something." "What's that?" Instead of answering with words, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something small wrapped in cloth. When he unfolded it, she saw a piece of metalwork unlike anything she'd ever seen. 2 letters, Say's and B, intertwined in an intricate pattern that formed a heart nestled inside a horseshoe. "I made this," he said. "It's a brand design. I was hoping, I thought maybe He stopped, took a breath, and started again. I don't want to be your employee, Zadie. I don't want to be your foreman or your hired hand. I want to be your partner, your husband, your home. She stared at the brand in his palm, tracing the delicate metalwork with one finger. It's beautiful. Is that a yes? Instead of answering, she kissed him, and he tasted tears on her lips. Whether from joy or sorrow, he couldn't tell. That's a yes, she whispered against his mouth. That's absolutely, completely, forever yes. They were married 3 weeks later, on the south lawn of Creel Ranch, under an arch of wild roses that Orville had spent 2 days constructing without dropping, tripping over, or otherwise destroying. Half the territory attended, including several families who had initially been skeptical of the match, but had been won over by Briggs's steady competence and obvious devotion to his bride. Cortland Vera attended as well, apparently unable to resist one final attempt at disruption. When the time came for toasts, he stood with a crystal glass raised high and an expression of barely concealed malice. To the happy couple, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled guests. May their union prove as lasting as their respective pedigrees would suggest. The insult hung in the air like smoke, and several guests shifted uncomfortably. Before anyone could respond, however, Orville appeared at Vera's elbow, carrying a large pitcher of what appeared to be lemonade. "Oh, Mr. Vera," he exclaimed with genuine enthusiasm. "I'm so glad you're here. I wanted to thank you personally for inspiring me to improve my balance and coordination. Ever since that dinner at the hotel, I've been practicing not dropping things, and I'm getting much better at." What happened next was either a genuine accident or the most perfectly timed piece of clumsiness in the history of the Montana Territory. The pitcher tilted, its contents cascading over Vera's head and shoulders in a citrusy waterfall that left him standing in a puddle of lemonade and crushed mint. "Oops," Orville said, but his grin suggested the mishap had been entirely intentional. The crowd erupted in laughter and applause, and Vera, his dignity thoroughly soaked, made his excuses and departed with as much haste as his dignity would allow. That evening, as the last guests departed and the household settled into quiet, Briggs and Zadie found themselves alone for the first time as husband and wife. They walked slowly toward the main house, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, both of them still giddy from the day's festivities. "So," she said, as they reached the front porch, "what happens now?" "Now," he said, lifting her effortlessly into his arms, "we go home." He carried her across the threshold and up the wide staircase to the master bedroom, where Mrs. Henley had lit candles and turned down the bedsheets with a preciseness that suggested military training. When he set her down, she was laughing, her cheeks flushed and her hair coming loose from its elegant arrangement. "I love you, Briggs Talford," she said, reaching up to unknot his tie. "I love you too, Zadie Talford," he replied, and the sound of her new name on his lips was sweeter than any music. The bedroom door closed softly behind them, and the rest of the night belonged to them alone. 2.5 years later, Creel Talford Ranch had become the most successful cattle operation in the Montana Territory. The hyphenated name on the gate reflected not just a marriage, but a true partnership, with Zadie's business acumen and Briggs's practical knowledge combining to create something neither could have achieved alone. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Briggs attempted to feed breakfast to 2 energetic 18-month-old twins, while simultaneously reviewing water schedules and trying to prevent young Thomas from dumping oatmeal on his sister's head. "Emma, no," he said firmly, as the little girl reached for her brother's spoon. "Use your own spoon, sweetheart." Emma Talford fixed him with a stern look that was pure Zadie, then deliberately knocked her bowl off the high chair tray. Thomas, not to be outdone, followed suit with his own bowl, creating a spectacular mess that would have made Orville proud. "I see they're continuing their advanced studies in gravity," Zadie said, entering the kitchen with baby Rose tucked against her shoulder. At 6 months old, Rose was the image of her father, with dark hair and serious brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. "They're definitely getting the scientific method down," Briggs agreed, wiping oatmeal from Thomas's hair. "Though I'm not sure Mrs. Henley appreciates their experimental approach to breakfast." As if summoned by her name, the housekeeper appeared in the doorway, took one look at the oatmeal-decorated kitchen, and sighed the sigh of a woman who had long ago given up on maintaining perfect order in a house full of children and chaos. "I'll get the mops," she said, but there was fondness in her voice. The twins had thoroughly won her heart, despite their talent for creative destruction. "Actually," Zadie said, settling Rose in her cradle by the window, "I have a better idea. Why don't we let Uncle Orville handle breakfast duty today? He's been wanting to try out that new recipe for baby-friendly pancakes." As if responding to a cue, Orville burst through the kitchen door, carrying a mixing bowl and wearing an apron decorated with flower handprints. "Did somebody say pancakes?" he announced. "Because I've been practicing, and I think I've finally figured out how to make them without setting anything on fire, though there was that incident with the griddle yesterday, but I think that was more about the temperature than the technique." And he stopped mid-sentence as he took in the oatmeal disaster. "So I see the little ones have been having art class again." Thomas and Emma immediately perked up at the sight of their favorite uncle, both of them reaching toward him with sticky hands and delighted babbles. "Uncle Orville," Thomas managed, one of his few clear words. "More," Emma added, banging her spoon on her tray. Within minutes, Orville had the twins cleaned up and settled with plates of perfectly golden pancakes cut into small, manageable pieces. Briggs watched with amazement as the man who couldn't walk across a room without tripping somehow managed to feed 2 toddlers without spilling so much as a drop of syrup. "How does he do that?" he asked Zadie. "I think chaos recognizes its own," she replied with a smile. With the children happily occupied, Briggs and Zadie moved to the ranch office to review the day's business. The walls were now decorated with an eclectic mix of cattle breeding charts, water system diagrams, and crayon artwork that Emma had insisted were important papers requiring prominent display. "The Morrison order out of Sacramento came in," Zadie said, settling behind her desk with a cup of coffee. "They want another 50 head of our grass-fed cattle for their restaurant group. That's the 3rd restaurant group this month," Briggs noted, consulting his own ledger. "Word's getting out about our methods." Their sustainable grazing techniques had attracted attention throughout the territory and beyond. Briggs had developed a system of rotating pastures that kept the grass healthy while producing cattle with superior meat quality. Zadie had turned this into a premium brand that commanded twice the price of conventional beef. "Speaking of which," she continued, "I've had 3 more inquiries about the women's ranching program. Sarah Henderson wants to bring her daughters for the summer session, and the widow Patterson is interested in learning our bookkeeping methods." Zadie's mentorship program had started almost by accident when young women began asking her for advice on running ranch operations. It had grown into a formal summer school that taught everything from cattle management to business planning, with graduates now running successful operations throughout the West. "And my water cooperative meeting is this afternoon," Briggs added. "We've got 12 ranchers signed up now, and the engineers think we can extend the main irrigation line another 5 miles before winter." His cooperative had solved the water disputes that had plagued the territory for years, creating a shared system that benefited everyone involved. The success had attracted inquiries from other territories, and there was talk of publishing his methods in agricultural journals back east. A crash from the kitchen interrupted their business discussion, followed by Orville's cheerful voice calling, "It's okay, nothing's broken." Well, mostly nothing. The plate was already cracked. Briggs and Zadie looked at each other and burst into laughter. Some things, they agreed, would never change. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the family gathered on the ridge overlooking their ranch. Briggs held Rose while Thomas and Emma chased fireflies through the tall grass, their delighted shrieks echoing across the valley. Below them, the ranch buildings glowed with warm yellow light, and cattle dotted the pastures like scattered stars. "Look at what we built," Zadie said softly, settling against Briggs's side. "We built it," he agreed. "Every acre, every fence post, every crying baby at 3 in the morning." She turned to look at him, her green eyes sparkling with mischief. "Speaking of building things, I've been thinking about that old line of yours." "Which line would that be?" "Oh, I think you know." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Something about putting the tip." Briggs grinned, the same playful expression he'd worn in the barn all those years ago. "Only with your permission, Mrs. Talford." "Always," she whispered, and kissed him as the sun set behind the mountains and their children's laughter filled the evening air. From somewhere below, they could hear Orville's voice calling from the ranch house, probably announcing dinner with his usual enthusiasm and at least one minor catastrophe. But here on the ridge, with the whole of their life spread out before them like a promise kept, there was only contentment and the certain knowledge that they had found exactly what they'd been searching for all along. "Home," Zadie said softly. "Home," Briggs agreed. And in that single word was everything they had built together: love, laughter, legacy, and a lifetime of yes.